Hi, class. So we finished our last lesson with the Reign of Terror, which, remember, it lasted essentially from April of 1793 to July of 1794, where Robespierre himself got the losing end of the guillotine. So it looks like France was done with this low point of the revolution. And that's true, especially from the point of view of the French people, right? The killings can stop. And then we go into 1795. France is doing well in its wars. Remember, in the background, I told you to remember that there were the French Revolutionary Wars that were going on. So France was essentially at war with the rest of Europe, with Prussia, Spain, Italy, Austria, and Britain. And so in 1795, the war is going pretty well for France, and peace is declared between France and Prussia and Spain. And remember, Prussia is what modern day Germany is, right? That's the name. So the only two major enemies left for France now are Great Britain and Austria. Those are the two most powerful. So slowly, France is dealing with its enemies. And this was essentially a victory for France. So France is victorious with its huge citizen army. Remember that it had created an army, had conscripted and drafted citizens into the army. And this was in April of 1795. And then in August of 1795, the new republic constitution gets approved and it gets ratified through a vote of the people. And this makes France officially a republic. So they don't need kings anymore. They don't have a king or monarchy anymore. And this constitution, it set up a governing structure where the executive was essentially this group of 5 directors. So the executive is called the directory. So you don't have like just one president, right? You have 5 directors. And then the legislature, and this is important because this was the first bicameral legislature for France. So that means that it had 2 houses. Think of the US Congress, right? We have the House of Representatives and the Senate, right? So in France's legislature back then, it had the Council of 500, which is similar to the US House of Representatives. So it had 500 members in it, 500 representatives. And uh, you also had the Council of Elders, which had 250 representatives. And that, if you want to view it from like the US point of view, that was similar to the US Senate. And so the directory, the members of the directory, who are called the directors, those candidates who could become the directors, they were submitted by the Council of 500 to the Council of Elders. So the Council of 500 would produce a list of candidates and send that to the Council of Elders. And then the Council of Elders would pick the 5 directors who would make up the directory. So if the 5 people who would essentially be the executive in France. So as you can see, things are looking really well, right? They're getting a structured government, right? Maybe things might calm down a bit. But even though they had the military victories, there was still a lot of unrest. You still had royalists out there. You still had Great Britain causing trouble, right? Great Britain actually at this time was attacking the western regions of France still. And there were royalists throughout Paris. And remember, Paris is like the capital, it's like the largest city in France. So there's royalists all throughout Paris. And then in October of 1795, there was a royalist uprising. And royalists are the people who wanted to bring back the crown, to bring back the monarchy. They were against the revolutionary government. And to a large degree, they weren't just upset about the fact that the royalty is gone. They were also upset that they were being excluded from the directory. So the directory, it excluded the royalists. So before the directory could even form in any major way, before the government of France, the new government of France could really form, you had this royalist uprising in Paris. And they stormed the Tuileries. And the Tuileries is this place where the king and queen were under house arrest at one time. And later, they were actually assaulted by the revolutionary government. So that was this painting right here, the painting you see on the screen. So that was depicting the king and queen in the Tuileries. And this was only 3 years ago, right? This was in 1792. And this is when they actually took the king and queen prisoner. And then they executed Louis only a few months after this. So now in 1795, it was the other way around. So instead of the royalty being in the Tuileries and being besieged by the revolutionaries, now the revolutionary government, the new revolutionary government of France, was in the Tuileries, in this building, in this place. And it was being besieged by royalists. And actually, the situation did not look good at all for the revolutionary government. They were outnumbered, clearly outnumbered. It looked like the royalists had better numbers. But luckily for the revolutionary government, there was a young, very ambitious, very egotistical military captain at this point who had observed the siege of Tuileries when Louis and Marie Antoinette were captured. So he had seen it for himself. And that was Napoleon Bonaparte, right? And back then, Napoleon, he made a mental note. He said, you know, they would have been able to stop the siege if only they had good artillery. And so Napoleon Bonaparte, he was an artillery captain. That's actually where he first became famous, and people around France knew who he was because of that. And so in this battle called the Siege of Toulon, he was able to use artillery very effectively to suppress a rebellion. So he was actually observing this scene right here. He saw this for himself 3 years earlier in 1792. Then in 1795, as the revolutionary government is in the Tuileries and as the royalists are about to essentially take over, Napoleon, using what he learned when he observed the first time, he was able to place cannons and artillery in such a way, and he shot what they call a grape shot. And it's essentially like a shotgun coming out of a cannon. And even though they were significantly outnumbered by the royalists, he was essentially able to mow them down, the royalists. He was able to mow down the royalists with the cannons. So even though you had more numbers on the royalist side, the revolutionary government and Napoleon, they had all these cannons. So you can see right here in the bottom left, this is what one of the cannons would have looked like. And you can see the actual ammunition here would be these little pellets right here. And that's why it was called a grape shot. It looked like a bundle of grapes. And when you shot it out, it would go off in every direction. So you could imagine it would just mow down whoever is in the way of the cannon, right? And so essentially Napoleon was able to save the revolutionary government and to allow the directory to come to power, right? And to put down, to suppress this rebellion. So, Napoleon was in the right place at the right time. And he was very competent, very smart in military tactics. By all measure, he was very egotistical, right? So he was full of himself. He was narcissistic, but he really knew what he was doing in terms of military strategy. And so Napoleon, because of this, becomes even more famous. And this event it took place on October 5th, 1795, where Napoleon is able to defend the revolutionary government. And this is known as Le 13 Vendémiaire, which is, it's like the month of October in the new French revolutionary calendar. Remember, I told you that they had made their new calendar and had given the months new names. So that was what the month of October was called in the French revolutionary calendar. And so this event on this day made Napoleon even more of a national hero or a revolutionary hero. And people started to realize that this guy, he definitely knew what he was doing. But you could imagine too, at the same time, the directory, right, the new government, they really didn't like Napoleon hanging around too close to the seats of power. He was obviously very ambitious. He was obviously very smart, very competent. And at some point, he might be a threat himself to the directory. So what did they do? They actually gave him power, but they made sure that he was far away from France. So he was essentially put in charge of the campaign into Italy. So France is right here in the pink, Italy's right here in yellow down here. And they were at war still, right? And he was put in charge of this campaign to go into Italy down here. And so remember, France is still fighting Austria, which is over here in the middle of Europe, and Great Britain, which is up here, the United Kingdom. So France is still at war with those countries. So we're fighting Austria and Italy, and Napoleon is made commander in chief of the Italian forces, and he's tremendously successful. This was kind of the least important front of the war with Austria at this point. But really, out of all the generals of the different fronts of the war, Napoleon is the one that proves himself to be one of the most innovative and tactical and an all around good general. So, this is right here Napoleon kicking butt in Italy, this picture. So, because of this, once again, he becomes even more famous, even more well known. And eventually, Austria admits that, hey, gee, we're not going to beat the French anymore. They're really doing really well against us. We're not doing that great. And they make peace with the French in October of 1797. So the Italian campaign occurred in 1796. So he defended the revolutionary government. Napoleon defended the revolutionary government in 1795. He kicks butt in Italy in 1796. In 1797, there's peace with Austria. So you only really have Great Britain left. But this peace with Austria is actually going to be very, very temporary. So this is from the Treaty of Campo Formio. And once again, this was peace with Austria. And France was the victor. They were victorious. So this is another French victory. And the only real enemy left was Great Britain. But the main problem was that Great Britain had the dominant navy in the world at the time. So France, and especially Napoleon, wasn't in a position to confront Great Britain on the water. And so this was a kind of controversial decision. But in 1798, and remember the Directory, they really didn't want Napoleon hanging around France, right? They're like, okay, you're hugely popular, you're a good general, you're a great general, you go do what you want, whatever you think is right, whatever you think is proper. So Napoleon gets it into his head to go attack Egypt. And people aren't 100% sure what was the main strategic goal of attacking Egypt. So in 1798, that's the date, he leaves Toulon, which is down here in the south of France, the port of Toulon. It was this port that Napoleon had actually helped to suppress during the revolution. So he leaves Toulon. He goes all the way down to Malta, the island of Malta down here in the Mediterranean Sea, and he takes that along the way. And then eventually he comes down here and he arrives in Egypt, right? And remember, Egypt is in North Africa, right? You should know where Egypt is. So he arrives in Egypt to essentially take over Egypt. And people believe that his desire to take over Egypt was essentially to, at some point, undermine the British in India. So remember that Britain, they had an empire, and one of their colonies was India. And India is on the other side of Africa and Asia, right? So Britain needs to be able to get through this region to trade with their colony, India. And so some thought maybe he wanted to take over Egypt, Napoleon wanted to take over Egypt to try to undermine the British in India. Maybe he might make some Muslim allies in Egypt and then maybe befriend some of the Muslim insurgents. And especially, they were also talking about this Tipu Sultan, who he was this leader in this region of the world at the time. And Napoleon, it was thought that Napoleon maybe wanted to talk with him, meet up with him, and maybe help to work together to defeat the British or to cause problems for the British. But people aren't quite sure. Historians aren't entirely sure why he went. It might have just been that Napoleon had some grand visions of being a conqueror and he wanted to go to Egypt because Egypt was once such a great empire in ancient history, and so maybe he just wanted to go there and take it over. So in 1798, Napoleon goes to Egypt, and these are some paintings here of him in Egypt. You can see the Sphinx there and the Battle of the Pyramids in the background, right? This is the Battle of the Pyramids. And so he was kind of able to defeat the Mamluk forces and the Mamluk forces, who were the people who were in power at the time in Egypt. And so once again, while he's in Egypt, Napoleon is hugely successful, except for one problem. So he brings his 20,000 troops into Egypt, obviously by ship, right? And they're sitting here, they're kicking butt in Egypt, but they're still at war with the British. So what do the British do with their dominant navy? They send Horatio Nelson, who is in charge of a fleet. And so the Britons send their fleet down here to Egypt, right? And he comes here where the French Navy was parked, and he just destroys them down in the ports near around Egypt, right? So Horatio Nelson, he's the British commander of the naval fleet, right? And he comes here where the French Navy was parked, destroys them. So Horatio Nelson destroys the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile. And the picture on the right is a depiction of that battle. And then on the left, this is Horatio Nelson right here. And so the Battle of the Nile basically strands. It causes Napoleon and his 20,000 person army to get stuck in Egypt, right? They lost this naval battle. They have no way of getting home. So, not really knowing what else to do, they can't leave with all their forces, right? Napoleon then goes into Damascus and Syria. So, if I go back to this map here, that's over in this region of the world. So, remember, Egypt is down here. Here's the pyramids, Cairo. And so, Napoleon and his forces go up here along the Mediterranean Sea, the coast, and you have Syria, which is right over here, and Damascus. So he takes his forces there and he causes all sorts of havoc, and he's raping and pillaging the area and whatnot. But it still kind of begs the question, how are they going to get back? And you can imagine that, for someone as ambitious and egotistical as Napoleon, he actually really didn't care a lot about what happened to his troops. And so when the opportunity came, he leaves. The opportunity came in 1799 when he left, and he left his entire army. So this gives you a big view into Napoleon's character, that he was willing to leave his entire army in Egypt and in Syria to essentially be left to die at the hands of the Ottoman Empire, which was in power in this region. And then he sneaks his way back to France. So in 1799, Napoleon goes back to France. And once he gets back there, he sees that the Directory is unbelievably unpopular. And the main reason is the reason that every government in France throughout this whole unit that we've been talking about has been unpopular. People in France are still hungry. France is still poor. In everything that I've talked about, in all of these lessons, right, in this entire unit, we still haven't addressed the issue that France is essentially broke and that people are still going hungry. So throughout all the violence, all of the wars, the executions, the reign of terror, the Directory is hugely unpopular still, right? They haven't fixed the main problems that France has been dealing with. And then a few of the directors, two of them in particular, actually three of the directors, want to plot with Napoleon, who was hugely popular, right? And they essentially plan a coup d'etat. And that means for them to overthrow the government. That's what a coup d'etat is. It's the overthrow of a government. And the way that they allow themselves to come to power is they resign. The directors resign. And then they tell the legislature that's meeting at the Tuileries, hey, you know what? There's a Jacobin revolt, right? The Jacobins are revolting and you're in danger. Why don't you go to this estate west of Paris where they normally meet? They tell them to go to an estate west of Paris. So the legislature goes here to this estate, and you'll be protected by Napoleon here. That's what they tell them. And they'll be protected by Napoleon and his army. Now, once they're there, right, the members of the Council of Elders and the Council of 500, right? Now, once they're there, Napoleon goes in and he starts making these speeches about these guys being essentially illegitimate. And he looks like he really wants to take power. And they just what they do is they jostle him out of the room, right? They get him out of the room. But once he's jostled out of the room, his brother points to the bruises on Napoleon. He tells the guards outside of where the legislature is meeting, hey, those guys in there, they're becoming violent. You have to go in there and take order. So that convinces the military. And they go in, the military goes in, and they essentially dissolve the legislature, right? They dissolve the Council of 500. So essentially, they've dissolved the legislature. Napoleon is in charge of the military that dissolved the legislature. And so that allowed Napoleon and two of the plotting directors to take power. So they became what is called the three consuls of France. They formed something called the consulate, or the new executive of France. And very shortly, they're going to have their own constitution. But this really marks the point where Napoleon takes power of France, because even though he took power with these other two dudes, he's able to scheme his way to be called the first consul, at which point he becomes this authoritarian ruler of France. So what's really changed in the last 10 years that we've studied of the French Revolution? What's happened over the course of this time? So we've gone from, over the course of the French Revolution, from 1789, where we had an absolute monarch in King Louis XVI, and now we go all the way to 1799, 10 years later, after all of this bloodshed, after multiple revolutions and counter-revolutions, and we end up with Napoleon, essentially being in charge of France as an authoritarian ruler. So that's going to be it for this lesson. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys in the next one.